The day I declared war on my homeowners association was the day a letter arrived threatening to take my home. The fine was for a ceramic frog in my wife's garden. The total they claimed I owed in fraudulent penalties was over $8,000. What the HOA president, a petty tyrant named Richard Abernathy, didn't know was that I'd spent 30 years in a world that eats men like him for breakfast. He was about to find out exactly who he was dealing with. If you've ever fantasized about getting biblical-level revenge on a power-tripping board member, you're in the right place. Tell me the craziest fine you've ever received in the comments below. I guarantee this story will make it look like a parking ticket. My name is Jack. For the better part of my adult life, I didn't really have a life in the conventional sense. I had a career, and that career had me. I was a builder, not of houses but of skylines. I built a commercial real estate empire from the unforgiving bedrock of downtown cores, a brutal world of high-stakes deals where the air was thin and the sharks circled constantly. My days were a blur of 80-hour work weeks, red-eye flights, and the sterile anonymity of luxury hotel rooms. This was a world where a misplaced decimal point could unravel a billion-dollar merger, and a handshake was only as good as the army of corporate lawyers standing behind it, ready to turn a covenant into a bloodbath. I learned to read the subtle tells of men under pressure, the flicker of fear in their eyes when they realized, 3 moves too late, that they were hopelessly outmaneuvered in a boardroom. I learned that victory didn't always go to the loudest man in the room, but to the one who had done the most thorough homework. I made a fortune, a staggering amount of money that afforded me every material comfort imaginable, but I paid for it with the one currency that can never be recouped: time. The memories that haunt me aren't of deals that went south, but of moments I let slip through my fingers. I vividly remember standing in the wings of a stuffy school auditorium, the smell of dust and cheap stage paint in the air, taking a call to close a skyscraper deal in Dallas. I was whispering frantic instructions to my legal team while my 7-year-old daughter was on stage for her second-grade play. I missed the one line she had practiced for weeks, the line she was so excited for me to hear. Her face when she saw me in the back, phone pressed to my ear, is a ghost that has followed me for decades. I missed birthdays that became voicemails, anniversaries that became lavish but late gifts, and the thousands of simple, unscripted moments that weave the true fabric of a life. When I finally sold my portfolio, it wasn't a celebration. It was an abdication. I walked away from the throne I had built with my own 2 hands, and my only goal was to get that lost time back, to find a life that was measured in sunrises, not quarterly earnings. My wife, Sarah, who had been my steadfast anchor through it all, and I began a quest for our sanctuary. We found what we thought was it in a leafy, sprawling suburb in Texas called Willow Creek. The marketing brochure was a masterpiece of idyllic propaganda, promising a harmonious community full of stock photos of smiling, impossibly attractive families at neighborhood barbecues. The words were carefully chosen: serenity, belonging, peace. I should have known then, from my years of dissecting contracts, that any place that has to advertise its harmony in writing probably has a deep and abiding lack of it. But we were seduced by the vision. Our house was more than just a building. It was the finish line of a marathon I had been running my entire life. A stately 2-story brick colonial with a sprawling backyard, shaded by ancient, magnificent oak trees that looked as if they had stood there for centuries, silent witnesses to generations of quiet living. For the first year it was everything the brochure promised and more. Life was blissfully, beautifully quiet. The loudest sound was the chirping of birds in the oak trees, a stark contrast to the sirens and shouts of the city. I finally had the time to work on my passion project, a cherry-red '67 Mustang I'd bought in my 20s and promised myself I would one day restore. For 30 years it had sat under a dusty tarp, a symbol of a deferred life. Now the scent of oil, metal, and gasoline became my new therapy. I spent my mornings under its hood, my hands greasy, my mind blessedly empty of everything but the mechanical puzzle in front of me. Sarah, finally free from the constraints of city balconies and rooftop pots, cultivated a garden that became the envy of the neighborhood. It was a riot of color and life, a testament to her patience and love, with fragrant roses, calming lavender, and hydrangeas the size of dinner plates. Life wasn't just quiet, it was rich, but we soon discovered that in the seemingly perfect garden of Willow Creek, the local serpent didn't slither on its belly. It drove a golf cart, wore its authority like a cheap, ill-fitting suit, and patrolled the streets with the unearned confidence of a tin-pot dictator. His name was Richard Abernathy, and he was the duly elected president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. He was a man whose soft physique and doughy, perpetually flushed face suggested a life devoid of any real struggle or meaningful work. Yet he carried himself with the grim self-importance of a general reviewing his troops. He patrolled our neighborhood not as a neighbor but as a warden, a clipboard his scepter and a measuring tape his sword. He wasn't searching for ways to build community. He was hunting for infractions, for deviations from his rigid, narrow view of suburban perfection. He saw himself as the noble guardian of neighborhood property values. In reality, he was a classic bully who had been handed a rule book and given the power to weaponize it against his neighbors. The campaign began subtly, almost comically. It started with a formal notice left in my mailbox, a crisp white envelope that felt oddly sinister among the junk mail and catalogs. My crime, according to the meticulously typed letter, was a grave one. The city-issued trash bin, which I had rolled to the curb for the morning pickup, was still visible from the street at 8:05 p.m. The HOA's arbitrary deadline was 8:00 p.m. sharp. The fine was $50. I laughed out loud, a genuine, hearty laugh. I showed it to Sarah, who was arranging a bouquet of her prize-winning roses on the kitchen island. $50 for 5 minutes? This guy must be kidding, I said. We came here for peace, Jack, she murmured, her brow furrowed with a hint of concern. It's silly, but it's easier to just pay it. That was my first mistake, a critical error in judgment. By paying it without question, I hadn't bought peace. I had signaled that I was an easy target, a compliant cash machine with no fight in him, a rich retiree who would rather throw money at a problem than deal with the hassle. In Abernathy's world, that was blood in the water. A week later, another fine arrived, this one taped directly to my front door, an escalation in its passive aggression. This time it was $75 for unapproved lawn height. Taped to the notice was a blurry, out-of-focus photo of a cheap plastic ruler stuck in my lush St. Augustine grass. He claimed the grass was a quarter-inch taller than the maximum 3 inches allowed by the bylaws. It was absurd, but again, I paid it. Then came a $100 penalty because a garden hose, which I had neatly coiled by the spigot, was done so in an aesthetically displeasing manner. 200 more followed because the small, hand-painted ceramic frog Sarah had placed in her flower bed, a cherished gift from our 7-year-old granddaughter, who had painted it for her in art class, was deemed an unauthorized statuary. Each notice was a little more aggressive in its wording, the language a little more threatening, full of capitalized phrases like immediate remediation required and failure to comply. It became painfully, infuriatingly clear that this wasn't about rules or maintaining neighborhood standards. This was targeted. This was a shakedown. My old due diligence instincts, honed over decades of sniffing out bad deals and hidden risks, kicked in. I started taking long walks through the neighborhood every morning, a fresh coffee in hand, my eyes now open and analytical. I saw dozens of other homes with the exact same violations I was being fined for. I saw trash bins left out for days on end, lawns that looked more like untamed jungles, and a veritable menagerie of garden gnomes, plastic flamingos, and even a life-sized metal giraffe peering over a fence. Yet, as I confirmed with a few friendly but cautious neighbors, the little white envelopes of judgment only ever seemed to land on my doorstep. The campaign had a singular focus: me. Abernathy would often drive by in his golf cart as I did my morning survey, slowing down just enough to give me a tight, smug little smile. It was a smile of dominance, of a small man enjoying the sliver of power he held over someone he perceived as his superior. He had fundamentally misjudged his man. He had mistaken my hard-earned desire for peace for weakness. He thought I was just another rich retiree who would pay endlessly to make problems go away. He was about to learn that my career had taught me that the only way to deal with a bully is to dismantle their power structure from the foundation up. I decided to make one final good-faith attempt to appeal to reason. I was still operating under the naive assumption that this was all a massive bureaucratic misunderstanding, that logic and evidence would surely prevail. I gathered my growing stack of violation notices, printed out the time-stamped photos of my supposed offenses, and spent an entire afternoon documenting over a dozen other homes with identical, and in many cases, far more egregious infractions that went completely ignored. I compiled everything into a professional evidence-based presentation, complete with annotated photos and cross-references to the specific HOA bylaws Abernathy was selectively enforcing. It was the same methodical approach I would have used for a zoning board meeting in my old life, designed to be irrefutable and clear. The HOA meeting was held in a soulless, rented conference room in a dreary, half-empty office park on the edge of town called Creek View Plaza. The place radiated failure. The air was stale with the smell of old coffee and quiet desperation, the atmosphere thick with the simmering resentment of the other homeowners who had been summoned to plead their own petty cases. Abernathy sat at the head of a long, cheap laminate table flanked by his silent, nervous board members, who looked more like hostages than colleagues. They stared down at their papers, avoiding eye contact with the supplicants before them. Abernathy, however, reveled in the ceremony. He tapped his microphone with a flourish, cleared his throat, and looked out upon the small gathering as if he were a man of great importance addressing a global summit instead of a handful of frustrated suburbanites in a dingy room. Before my turn, I listened to an elderly widow nearly break down in tears as she tried to appeal a fine for having the wrong shade of beige on her window trim. Abernathy denied her appeal with a dismissive wave of his hand. When the floor was opened for new comments, I calmly and respectfully approached the table. I laid out my case with the precision of a surgeon. I distributed copies of my presentation to Abernathy and the board. I showed them the photos of my quarter-inch too-tall grass next to photos of a neighbor's yard that resembled a hayfield. I showed them the picture of my aesthetically displeasing hose next to a picture of a tangled, kinked mess down the street. I wasn't asking for special treatment or an exemption from the rules. I was asking only for equal and fair application of their own bylaws, the very foundation of their authority. I spoke for less than 5 minutes, my tone even, and my argument unassailable. Abernathy let me finish, a cruel, self-satisfied smirk plastered on his doughy face. When I was done, he let an uncomfortable silence hang in the room, making sure every eye was on him, milking the moment for all it was worth. He leaned into his microphone, and the cheap speaker crackled with feedback. "Are you quite finished, Mr. Davis?" he asked, his voice dripping with a syrupy, condescending tone that set my teeth on edge. "It seems to me," he continued, looking around the room for approval, "that a man of your obvious means could afford to simply follow the rules or pay the price for not doing so." He paused, letting the insult land. "We're not interested in your big city presentations and your fancy folders here. We're a community of simple rules for simple folks. Maybe you think you're too good for them. Maybe this community isn't the right fit for you." He then clicked his microphone off with a theatrical flourish. "Appeal denied. Next." He had publicly humiliated me, twisting my logical appeal into an act of arrogance. He had framed me as an outsider, an arrogant rich guy who thought he was above the simple laws of their community. The other board members just stared at their papers, too cowardly or too complicit to look up. The other homeowners in the room just looked down, not wanting to become his next target. In that moment of profound disrespect, I realized this wasn't a community association. It was a fiefdom, a petty kingdom built on a foundation of fear, and Richard Abernathy was its sad, pathetic little king. The desire for peace was gone, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. The war was on. My public challenge at the HOA meeting didn't chasten him. It seemed to light a fire under his obsession. It was as if my refusal to bow down was a personal affront he could not tolerate. The harassment escalated from merely bureaucratic to deeply personal. He began parking his golf cart across the street from my house for hours at a time, just sitting there, watching. He made no attempt to hide it. He would just stare at my home, a pair of binoculars resting on his dashboard, a visible symbol of his invasive scrutiny. It was a psychological tactic designed to make us feel watched, to turn our sanctuary into a prison. Sarah started pulling the blinds during the day, her sense of peace shattered. "He's trying to intimidate us, Jack," she'd say, her voice tight with anxiety. The fines, which I now refused to pay on principle, continued to arrive, piling up on a side table in my office. They grew exponentially, each original fine now accompanied by exorbitant late fees and administrative penalties. The language in the letters became more and more threatening, full of legal jargon he was clearly copying and pasting from the internet. Terms like breach of covenant and legal remedies. Then came the letter that started the real war. It didn't come in a standard envelope. It arrived via certified mail, a tactic designed to look as official and terrifying as possible. The return address wasn't the HOA. It was from a supposed law firm, Abernathy, Smith & Associates, complete with a formal, embossed letterhead he'd obviously designed on his home computer and a prestigious-sounding downtown P.O. box address. The moment I held it, my 30 years of experience screamed that it was a sham. A real law firm has a physical address, a list of partners, a bar association number. This had none of that. Impersonating a law firm is not just a civil matter. It's a highly illegal, disbarable offense for any actual lawyer involved, not to mention felony fraud. I carefully filed that fact away in the back of my mind, a piece of ammunition for a later battle. I opened the letter. The contents were meant to be a kill shot. It stated in no uncertain terms that, due to an outstanding balance of over $8,000 in fines and fees, the HOA, represented by this phantom law firm, had successfully placed a lien on my property. It went on to declare their intent to initiate foreclosure proceedings in 30 days if the full balance was not paid immediately. Foreclosure, he was trying to use a stack of fake fines over a garden frog and a blade of grass to steal the home I had worked my entire life to build. He was threatening the peaceful retirement I had earned, the sanctuary I had promised my wife after decades of sacrifice. The quiet, peaceful life we had sought was over, replaced by a direct threat to our very home. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't a hot, angry snap of rage. It was a quiet, cold, and deliberate one. It was the distinct click of a tumbler falling into place in a complex lock. The peace-loving retiree puttering in the garage with his Mustang receded into the background. In his place stood the man who had built a real estate empire from nothing. The man who understood that the only way to deal with a predator is to become a bigger, smarter, and more ruthless one. Abernathy, in his arrogance and ignorance, had made a fatal mistake. He had brought the battle into my arena. Real estate, liens, contracts, leases, foreclosures. This wasn't his world of petty rules and neighborhood gossip. It was mine. He had just picked a fight with a master of the game on his home court. And in my world, when someone comes for your castle, you don't just defend the walls. You take their kingdom. Now, in the state of Texas, an HOA foreclosing on a homeowner for unpaid fines is an incredibly difficult and complex legal process. It's not something a tin-pot dictator like Abernathy can just declare in a letter. It requires extensive legal filings, court appearances, and ultimately a judge's approval, which is rarely given for non-payment of fines alone, especially when their legitimacy is in question. Abernathy wasn't relying on the law. He was relying on pure intimidation. He was holding up a paper tiger, a poorly executed bluff, counting on me to be too scared, too uninformed, or too weary to call him on it. His entire strategy was predicated on my ignorance. I was about to call that bluff in a way he could never possibly imagine. My first gut instinct was the old way: unleash the hounds. Hire my own team of cutthroat lawyers. Bury him and the HOA in litigation. File suit for harassment, fraud, and impersonating a law firm. I could drain their coffers, tie them up in depositions for years. and make their lives a living hell. But as I sat in my office, staring at the fraudulent foreclosure notice, I realized that would be a war of attrition fought on his turf, on his timeline. It would be long, messy, and while I would undoubtedly win, it would still consume my time and energy, the very things I had retired to reclaim. It would also give Abernathy exactly what he craved: attention. He would become a martyr, a small-town hero fighting the rich outsider. It was a symmetric response, and my entire career was built on finding asymmetric advantages. I decided to change the entire game board. I wasn't going to fight him over the fines. I wasn't going to fight him over the lien. I wasn't even going to fight him over my house. I was going to take his, not his personal residence, but his seat of power, the source of his authority, the miserable little office in that dreary office park from which he lorded over his kingdom. The idea solidified in my mind with crystalline clarity. He thought the fight was about bylaws and neighborhood rules. I was going to make it about lease agreements, property law, and corporate ownership. He was playing checkers in his backyard. I was about to play three-dimensional chess on a global scale. It was time to stop reacting and go on the offensive. The core of my plan was simple and brutal. I would become his landlord. The man who wanted to take my home would have to come to me, hat in hand, to ask for permission to keep his. It was a strategy born from 3 decades in the trenches of commercial real estate. Find your opponent's source of power, control it, and then squeeze. Abernathy's power wasn't in the bylaws. It was in the physical office that gave him the illusion of legitimacy. He was about to find out what it felt like to have his own sanctuary threatened. The hunter was about to become the hunted. I did what I have done 1,000 times before a big acquisition. I started with due diligence. The next morning I drove back to that dreary office park, Creekview Plaza. But this time my perspective had shifted. I wasn't a frustrated homeowner anymore. I was a predator sizing up its prey. I parked across the street and spent an hour just observing. I noted the peeling paint on the window frames, the dark water stains blooming on the ceilings of the covered walkway, the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, and the general air of neglect that hung over the property like a shroud. This wasn't a prime asset. It was a forgotten one, a line item on a distant balance sheet. Back in my home office, I transformed my quiet suburban study into the command center it once was. Surrounded by multiple monitors displaying satellite imagery, county records, and financial data services, I slipped back into my old skin, using the best subscription data services money can buy, the kind that cost more per year than a luxury car. I pulled the public records, the complete mortgage history, the tax assessments, and the full title history for the property parcel. The hunt was officially on. My research quickly bore fruit. The initial records confirmed what I had suspected. The Willow Creek HOA was not an owner. They were merely a tenant on a standard 5-year commercial lease, with just under 2 years remaining. A little more digging led me to the building's legal owner, a generic, faceless, limited liability company registered in Delaware, Creekview Holdings, LLC. It was a classic shell corporation, designed specifically to obscure the true ownership and limit liability. For an amateur, the trail might have gone cold right there. For me, it was just the beginning of the breadcrumb trail. Using my access to more advanced corporate linkage databases, I traced the LLC's ownership structure through 2 more layers of shell companies, finally terminating at a mid-sized commercial real estate investment firm based out of Chicago. I picked up the phone and called a number I hadn't dialed in years. "Maria," I said when she answered, "it's Jack." Maria had been my executive assistant for over 20 years, a magician who could conjure information out of thin air and get anyone in the world on the phone. She had happily accepted a generous retainer to stay on for exactly this kind of special project. She was sharper than any private investigator I knew. "I need a full workup on a property called Creekview Plaza in Texas," I instructed. "And I want everything you can find on its ultimate owner, a firm called Midwest Property Holdings. I want their strategy, their financials, their recent SEC filings, their board minutes if you can get them, their pain points, everything. I want to know what the CEO had for breakfast and if he enjoyed it." Maria's exquisitely detailed report hit my inbox less than 24 hours later. It was a masterclass in corporate intelligence, a perfect blueprint of my target's vulnerabilities. It was exactly what I had hoped for. Midwest Property Holdings was under significant pressure from their institutional investors to deleverage and trim their portfolio. They were in the process of liquidating smaller, underperforming, out-of-state assets to consolidate and focus on their core markets in the upper Midwest. Creekview Plaza, with its high vacancy rate, deferred maintenance, and middling rent roll, was highlighted on an internal document as a Tier 3, non-core asset flagged for divestment. It was a C-class property 1,000 miles from their headquarters that was an annoyance on their balance sheet, a distraction from their primary strategy. And as I've always said, one man's annoyance is another man's unparalleled opportunity. The target was not only identified, it was wounded and ready to be taken down. I didn't bother with the traditional channels. Engaging brokers or intermediaries would slow things down, create a paper trail, and potentially alert my target. In a situation like this, speed and surprise are paramount. Using the intelligence Maria had gathered, I found the direct private line for the CEO of Midwest Property Holdings, a man named Robert Patterson. I got past his executive assistant by casually mentioning a few mutual acquaintances from a massive industrial park deal I'd done in the Chicago suburbs a decade prior. The name-dropping worked. Patterson got on the line, his voice a mixture of caution and curiosity. I got straight to the point. "Mr. Patterson, my name is Jack Davis. I'm a private investor. I want to buy Creekview Plaza," I said, my tone matter of fact. "It's an underperforming asset for you. It's a management distraction, and it's well outside your core operational territory. I'll make this very easy for you. I'm offering 10% over your most recent internal valuation, all cash. We can close in 3 weeks." There was a stunned pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. "That's an extremely aggressive timeline, Mr. Davis," he said, the suspicion in his voice now tinged with intrigue. A deal this fast, this clean, was almost unheard of. "I have the capital secured and my legal team is on standby, ready to mobilize today," I replied coolly. "This is a simple, clean transaction. There will be no financing contingencies. I'll waive the formal inspection period. You get this headache off your books and a cash infusion in your account before your next quarterly report to your investors. You'll be a hero." I could feel his resistance melting away. He was a man under pressure, and I had just offered him the perfect release valve. "I'll have a signed binding letter of intent in your inbox in the next 30 minutes, I added, closing the deal. He agreed. The deal was too good, too fast, and too easy to refuse. While Richard Abernathy was busy drafting his next threatening letter about the precise curvature of my garden hose, I was in the process of executing a multi-million-dollar acquisition of the building his entire operation was housed in. For the next 3 weeks, as the lawyers hammered out the details and the funds were placed in escrow, I had to play the part of the beaten man. I went completely silent. I stopped answering the HOA's letters. I let my grass grow another 1/4 inch and didn't bother to hide my trash bin from view. From the outside, it looked like I had given up. Abernathy grew bolder, his arrogance swelling with each passing day of my silence. A neighbor told me that Abernathy had boasted at a small neighborhood get-together that he was finally dealing with the troublemaker from the city, and that I'd be out of my house by Christmas. Let him gloat, I thought. Pride goeth before a spectacular, and in this case, a meticulously engineered fall. Then, on a Tuesday morning, my personal lawyer called me. His voice was calm. "The Eagle has landed, Jack. The wire transfer is confirmed. The deed is recorded. As of 5 minutes ago, Creekview Plaza is yours." Phase 1 was complete. The board was set. The pieces were in place. With the property secured, it was time to prepare for Phase 2. The ambush. I immediately convened a conference call with my legal team. "I want you to draft a formal notice to all tenants of Creekview Plaza," I instructed. "Standard notification of the change in ownership and instructions on where to direct all future rental payments. Make it professional, courteous, and utterly unremarkable." Then I gave them their real task. I also want you to scrutinize the Willow Creek Homeowners Association's lease agreement with a fine-toothed comb. I want to know every right I have as the new landlord. I want every loophole, every weakness, every single contractual advantage. As I suspected, the lease was a boilerplate document, a generic template the previous owners, Midwest Property Holdings, likely used for all their small, insignificant tenants. It was a document drafted out of laziness, not precision. And right there, nestled in Section 14B, under the heading Change of Ownership, was the fatal flaw. It was a standard clause, but an amateur one for a landlord to grant. It allowed for the renegotiation of terms, including and especially rental rates, upon the sale or transfer of the building's ownership. It was the legal loophole I needed, the fulcrum upon which my entire plan would pivot. The previous owners hadn't cared enough to negotiate a stronger lease, and the HOA, in its amateurism, had never thought to question it. They had signed their own death warrant years ago. Now it was time to bait the trap. I looked up the main number for the HOA office and dialed. Abernathy himself answered, his voice oozing a smug satisfaction that was almost comical. "Mr. Davis," he said, recognizing my name. "I'm glad you called. I was just about to have our lawyers contact you regarding the foreclosure filing. Time is running out. Are you calling to finally pay your outstanding balance?" I forced a sigh into my voice, playing the part of a man at the end of his rope. "Something like that, Richard," I said, keeping my tone even and defeated. "Look, this has gone on long enough. I'd like to propose a settlement. Can we meet? Your office, tomorrow at 10 a.m. Just you and the board. No lawyers. Let's just resolve this neighbor to neighbor." The hook was set. He believed I was coming to his office to surrender, to beg for mercy, to write a check and put my tail between my legs. The thought of my capitulation was too delicious for him to resist. "I think that can be arranged," he said, the triumph in his voice palpable. 10 a.m. it is. He was walking directly into a perfectly prepared ambush, blinded by his own arrogance. I hung up the phone and allowed myself a small, cold smile. The game was about to get very, very interesting. The next morning, I walked into that same stale conference room at Creekview Plaza. The stage was set exactly as it had been during my prior humiliation, but this time I was not the supplicant. I was the executioner. Abernathy and his board were arranged around the table, shuffling papers and trying to look important, posturing for the defeated man they expected to see. "Jack," Abernathy said with a triumphant grin, not even bothering to stand as I entered. "Glad you finally came to your senses and decided to be a reasonable neighbor." He gestured to a chair at the far end of the table, the one reserved for petitioners. "The total amount owed, with the latest round of legal fees my office has had to prepare for the foreclosure, is now $9,450. If you can provide that in the form of a certified check, we can put this all behind us." I let the silence hang in the air, letting his arrogance fill the room. I slowly walked not to the petitioner's chair, but to the empty space at the head of the table directly opposite Abernathy. I placed my expensive leather briefcase on the polished surface with a quiet, authoritative thud. "No, Richard, I don't think I will," I said calmly, my voice resonating in the quiet room. "I'm not here to talk about my house. I'm here to talk about your office." I reached into my briefcase, pulled out a thick bound document, and slid it firmly across the polished table toward him. It was a certified recorded copy of the grant deed to the entire Creekview Plaza office park. Prominently displayed on the front page under the heading Grantee was the name of my personal LLC. The color drained from Abernathy's face as if a plug had been pulled. His smug grin dissolved into a slack-jawed mask of confusion. He picked up the document with a trembling hand, his eyes scanning the dense legal text, unable to process what he was seeing. What is this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, the bravado completely gone. "That," I said, my voice as cold and hard as granite, "is the deed to this building. As of 9 a.m. yesterday, I own it. I own the walls that surround you, the ceiling above your head, the floor beneath your feet, and the parking lot your golf cart is currently parked in." "Which, Richard?" I paused, leaning forward slightly to look him dead in the eye. "Makes me your landlord." The board members looked at each other in dawning horror, their chairs scraping on the floor as they shifted uncomfortably. A wave of panic was visibly washing over them. Before Abernathy could even formulate a response, I slid a second document across the table. It was their new lease proposal. As the new owner, I explained in a flat, businesslike tone, I am exercising my right to renegotiate your lease, per Section 14B of your signed rental agreement. Your old agreement is hereby terminated, effective immediately. Here is the new offer. I tapped the paper in front of him. As you'll see, the monthly rent has been adjusted upward to reflect current fair market rates, which I'm afraid are substantially higher than the sweetheart deal you were getting. It's quadrupled. Also, my management team performed a routine audit of the Common Area Maintenance Charges, or CAMs. It appears you've been significantly underpaying for the last 3 years. I've corrected that accounting error and added the balance due to your first month's rent. I stood up straight. That total is due by noon tomorrow to avoid eviction proceedings. Welcome to the building. He had tried to take my home for a fraudulent bill of less than $10,000. I had just presented him with a legally binding bill that would bankrupt the entire association in a single month. Checkmate. For a moment there was only the sound of Abernathy's ragged breathing. Then the shock gave way to sputtering rage. He shot to his feet, his face a blotchy, furious red. "This is illegal!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "This is harassment! You can't do this! I'll sue you into the ground. I'll have you sanctioned. I'll have your law license revoked." "I'm not a lawyer, Richard," I cut him off, my voice dropping lower, a quiet assertion of dominance that silenced his tirade mid-sentence. "And you'll do nothing, because the rent, as steep as it is now the very least of your problems. You see, Richard, when you buy a commercial property, it's standard procedure to perform due diligence on the tenants, especially any that might be a credit risk. And your HOA, with its history of late payments to the previous owner, was a major red flag. So I hired a forensic accountant, the best in the state, to take a discreet look into the HOA's finances. And what we found was fascinating." I paused, turning my gaze away from Abernathy to look directly at the other board members one by one. They were shrinking in their seats, trying to become invisible, their faces pale with terror. I had their complete and undivided attention. I opened my briefcase again and pulled out another, even thicker binder. We found years of highly questionable, if not outright fraudulent, invoices. We found regular monthly payments to non-existent landscaping companies. For example, Evergreen Solutions, which received over $30,000 last year, doesn't seem to exist anywhere but on your invoices. There's no state registration, no business license, no address. We found checks for thousands of dollars in legal consulting written out to a P.O. box in Florida. After a little digging, my people traced that P.O. box back to your brother-in-law, who, as it turns out, is a fishing boat captain in the Keys, not a member of the Florida Bar. I looked back at Abernathy. It turns out the HOA isn't just broke. It's broke because you've been using it as your personal ATM for years. Abernathy was as white as a sheet, his bravado completely replaced by pure, naked fear. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting toward the door as if contemplating a futile escape. "Those fake fines you levied against me and other homeowners, they weren't just a power trip, were they, Richard? They were a desperate attempt to cover the holes you were creating in the budget. You were shaking down your neighbors to conceal your own theft." I leaned forward, my voice barely a whisper but carrying the weight of a death sentence. I took this mountain of evidence, detailing what looks like a clear pattern of embezzlement, wire fraud, and what a prosecutor might even call a racketeering enterprise, and had my lawyers package it all up. That package was delivered by courier to the district attorney's office 2 days ago. They were very, very interested in your creative accounting and your fake law firm. In fact, I spoke with an investigator this morning. They're opening a formal criminal investigation. That was the kill shot. The game was over. In the space of 10 minutes, he was no longer president of the HOA. He was a common criminal who had just been exposed in front of his entire crew. His little kingdom had crumbled, and the walls of a prison cell were closing in. The fallout was as swift as it was brutal. Within a week, the district attorney's office publicly announced that Richard Abernathy was under active investigation for felony embezzlement and wire fraud. The story hit the local news, complete with a picture of the unassuming Creekview Plaza and a very unflattering photo of Abernathy taken at a prior town event. He looked small, petty, and guilty. Terrified of being charged as co-conspirators in his scheme, the other board members turned on him instantly, stampeding over each other to cooperate with prosecutors. They provided sworn affidavits, internal emails, and even more evidence of his schemes, each one trying to paint themselves as an unwitting victim of his manipulation. His pathetic little empire of fear dissolved overnight. Suddenly, I wasn't the neighborhood pariah anymore. My phone started ringing. Homeowners I had never met started stopping me in the street to thank me, to shake my hand, and to share their own stories of Abernathy's bullying and extortion. The elderly woman who had been fined for her unpatriotically short flagpole brought us a freshly baked pecan pie, tears in her eyes as she thanked me for standing up to him. A young family, fined hundreds of dollars because their children's brightly colored swing set was not in harmony with the community's natural aesthetic, dropped off a thank you card drawn by their kids. It became clear that I wasn't his only victim. I was just the first one with the specific, and rather unique, set of skills required to fight back on a battlefield of my own choosing. Abernathy, facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence and with zero allies left, saw the writing on the wall. His legal battle was short and pathetic. He eventually pleaded guilty to multiple counts of felony embezzlement to avoid a more prolonged trial and further charges. A judge sentenced him to 3 years in a state prison and ordered him to pay full restitution to the HOA, a sum he would likely spend the rest of his life trying to earn back. A special community meeting was called, not in the dreary conference room of my acquisition, but in the large, hopeful space of the local high school auditorium. This time, when I walked in with Sarah by my side, I was met not with suspicion or fear, but with a spontaneous round of applause that echoed through the hall. The community, finally free, was taking its first breath. The old board was formally dissolved in disgrace. A motion was quickly passed to void all of Abernathy's fraudulent fines going back 5 years, and a new, interim board of genuinely concerned and qualified homeowners was elected on the spot. As for the lease on the HOA office, I was never interested in bankrupting the community, only the criminal who was running it. A week later, I met with the new board, a retired teacher, a sharp-witted accountant, and a practical engineer. I sat down with them at the same table where I had dismantled Abernathy, and I offered them a brand-new 10-year lease at a fair market rate with transparent, easy-to-understand terms. My goal was never to be a tyrant landlord. I just had to become one long enough to surgically remove the resident tyrant. I then sold the building 6 months later to a local investor, my purpose for owning it having been fulfilled. My life in Willow Creek is quiet again. The birds in the ancient oak trees are once again the loudest sound in the mornings. The neighborhood, free from the grip of its petty dictator, is thriving under its new collaborative leadership. The community barbecues advertised in the brochure are actually happening now, and people are smiling. My '67 Mustang is finally beautifully restored. On sunny Texas days, I take it for a drive with the top down. The satisfying rumble of its powerful V8 engine, a feeling of contentment I feel deep in my bones. It's the sound of a promise kept to myself. Sarah's garden is flourishing, a riot of life and color, completely free from the threat of being fined for a much-loved hand-painted ceramic frog, which now sits in a place of honor among the roses. The peace we came here for is real this time, not just found, but earned and protected. Abernathy made a fundamental error I've seen countless amateurs make in the boardroom and in life. He mistook a desire for quiet as a sign of weakness. He saw a man who wanted to be left alone and assumed he was a man who couldn't fight. He tried to take my castle without ever stopping to wonder if I had spent a lifetime learning how to buy and sell entire kingdoms. He learned a core lesson of business and of life, the hard way. Before you start a war, you had better be damn sure you know who you're fighting. Because justice isn't always found in a courtroom with lawyers arguing. Sometimes it's found on a balance sheet. Sometimes it's delivered in the form of a new lease agreement. That's my story. Have you ever had an HOA from hell? A story of a bully who got what was coming to them? Share it in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video and share it if you believe in justice served cold.